Hi, everyone. Welcome to Baden Hill, and I just want to share with you a personal reflection. One of the greatest blessings, one of the greatest joys of making these videos is my own learning. It gives me a chance to process things that I learned over the course of my childhood into my current adulthood. Honestly, things fade. You forget details. You forget very important things that make us who we are. And so this video is a very special one. It's a very important one. And it has to do with the American Civil War. Now, you might be curious about the title that you saw on the opening screen. You might wonder why I'm calling this John Brown's Body. Well, hopefully you'll understand as you get to the end of this first segment, and you'll see that one man is a symbol for what was happening in our country long before the Civil War, but especially during the Civil War, and honestly, it's still going on today. So, on that note and that vague reference, I want to start talking about the American Civil War. Since Europeans came to the United States, and when I say the United States, I mean the New World. Since Europeans came to this part of the world, there has been slavery. In fact, Columbus brought the institution of slavery with him by making the native peoples here, the indigenous tribes, were made into slaves. Not all of them, but many of them. And right away it established the sense that Europeans thought that they were superior to other people. And eventually they would treat people like something less than a person. And this is what slavery is all about, when people treat other people like property. So slavery is sometimes put in the rearview mirror as if it's a thing of the past. I want to remind you, just as I always remind my students in the classroom, that there are more slaves in the world today than there were during the time of slavery. And it reminds us that this is a scourge that just won't go away. So, why? Why did slavery happen? Why did it continue? That's an issue that really is too big for this video. But we need to know that many people thought that slavery was actually a gift to people who couldn't take care of themselves. That's how evil their thinking was. They believed that they were somehow a benefactor, taking care of people, giving them something that was better than what they had naturally. In reality, slave life was not just difficult. It was a death sentence. And I think, again, I need to say right up front that many of my statistics and anecdotes come from the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War. He is someone who has brought important issues back to the mainstream because of his amazing filmmaking creativity and excellence. And so it's that documentary that has given me a lot of the information that I have. And he gives a statistic that maybe 4 out of every 100 African slaves that were brought to the U.S. or slaves that grew up in the U.S. being born here in slavery, only 4 in 100 achieved the age of 60. And so the mortality rate and the life expectancy were extremely low for slaves. And this didn't matter to slave owners. They believed that it was cheaper to bring slaves over and to have them die at a young age than to actually hire people and pay wages for the same labor. And so really, slavery is all about a cheap labor supply. And that reminds us that when we buy things, we need to know where they come from. We need to know how they're made. We need to understand what's happening in the countries that they're from. So slave life was not just difficult, it was a death sentence, and it was a situation where slaves worked from dawn until daylight was gone, and if there was a full moon, they kept working up to 14 hours a day. In terms of their adult life, they could get married, but every slave had to expect that they would be sold once or maybe more than once during their lifetime. When they were sold by themselves most of the time, and that means that if they had a family, they were separated from their families. So slave owners did not take into consideration that people were a family. And so how did slaves cope with this, and did they do anything to resist? We need to know that slaves did resist by not working. They refused to work. Some of them ran away, and others did violently oppose their masters after being treated like property. And there were two notable slave rebellions. One happened in 1739, and that's the Stono Rebellion. You may remember we learned about that. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. It involved the deaths, the murders of dozens of white people in the area where the slaves were being held. And so as a result, those who started the uprising, they were punished, they were executed, of course, and new laws were made to keep slaves from having any freedom. So the result of the Stono Rebellion was not any sort of progress. It was intense legal doubling down, making sure that slaves didn't have another uprising. Well, they did have another uprising, and this was not going to end. In 1831, Nat Turner led a rebellion, and it was actually much more eventful and impactful, and about 60 white people were killed by the slaves. And basically Nat Turner, he went from one plantation to the next, trying to get people to get the slaves there to rise up with him. And eventually the rebellion was put down, but Nat Turner was able to hide out for 2 months. And he obviously was eventually caught and was executed and made an example of. At that time, there was a threat against even free black people in the South. If there were any who were free, the threat was that they could be brought back into slavery if they were found doing anything wrong. And so you can see that this is a cycle. You have this terrible life of slavery, the slaves rise up, they are punished, and the white society tries to keep this from happening again by increasing laws and taking away rights, taking away the ability to assemble, and most of all, taking away any sniff of an education, because education is what helped these slaves know their condition and know that there was hope. What a cruel, evil thing that was done in our own country. People saw this. And it wasn't just people in the North. There were many people who saw the evils of slavery. And during the early 1800s, you had some momentum starting. I will connect it to what I'm teaching in my other history class, and that is the idea of revolution, the idea of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that, human beings are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. And this idea led to revolutions throughout the world. And in America, one of the most famous people who spoke out against slavery was William Lloyd Garrison. He was an abolitionist, and abolition meant to abolish or get rid of slavery. And he was echoing a lot of the things that had been said in England by William Wilberforce. And the success that Wilberforce had in England in getting the Parliament to abolish slavery was just a miracle from God. And so, Garrison didn't mince words. He said, you don't do things in moderation. You don't do them slowly and gradually. You don't gradually or moderately save your baby from a fire. And that is the kind of language that he used. He created a newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And so his whole goal was to get people to realize the evils of slavery. Another abolitionist was Frederick Douglass, who was a slave who eventually gained his freedom. And he was known for being half white and half black because he was the product of a relationship between a white slave owner and the black slave. And so he represented America in his blood, in his face. And he was very eloquent. And some people didn't even believe that he had ever been a slave. As a result, he had to write his own autobiography to prove that he had gone through slavery and had experienced those things. In addition, you have Harriet Tubman, who was basically the conductor of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was the way that slaves could escape from the South, and they went to a series of safe houses, safe locations along the way and in the North, because it's important to see that harboring fugitive slaves was actually a crime in the North, and for a long time. And that became a big part of the reason that the Civil War happened, because Northerners felt violated that the South could control their states with that simple idea that if a slave escaped to the North, that slave wasn't free and would be sent back to have to be a slave once more with his or her owner. So Harriet Tubman is famous for her role. And John Greenleaf Whittier was a writer, and he wrote in favor of abolition. And finally, Robert Purvis. Robert Purvis was from South Carolina, and already at age 17, he was speaking against slavery. So it's not just Northerners. And it's very important to see that it's a wide variety, men, women, black, white, and they were all against slavery. In addition, you have the Quakers, who were very adamant against slavery and were a big part of the Underground Railroad because they didn't want war, but they also believed that it was their duty to stand up against slavery. So, why? Why did the war happen? Many people try to trace the origins, the causes of the Civil War, just like any war. They want to know why it happened and how it might have been avoided. In many ways, it was inevitable. And some people would say that the Civil War started at the very moment that the new United States refused to reject slavery. When they acknowledged that slavery was okay, at least in part of their United States, they were on a collision course with conflict. And so we need to kind of dig into some other background, though. And one of the main things that caused slavery to happen was the products that were being produced in the colonies before the United States. The products required labor. And at first, there were indentured servants coming from England. They worked for a period of years, but that became too expensive. You couldn't make enough money, whether it was tobacco or cotton. And so a steady supply of cheap labor was necessary. But even then, it was too expensive to grow cotton and to take apart the husks, which are called the bolls, and the wispy, cottony stuff that we're used to thinking of as cotton and cotton balls. You had to take out the seed parts. And to do that, people had to do it by hand, and it was a very slow process. You couldn't produce a lot of cotton. Well, Eli Whitney a northerner who basically he wanted to make a name for himself. In 1793, he invented the cotton gin. Now, gin is not like alcohol. It's Gin, short for engine. So the cotton gin was a machine, and it separated the cotton from the shells, the husks, or the bolls. And from that point forward, producing cotton became viable and profitable, but you still needed the labor. You needed cheap labor, and so that's when the floodgates were opened and African slaves were imported to the South in numbers unforeseen up to that time. And so one machine, one cotton gin, could make 1,000 pounds of cotton clean from the seeds in one day. And that's how incredible that invention was for changing history. We can't blame Eli Whitney, but maybe we can realize that all of our actions do have consequences. Another person we need to look at is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a writer, and it was her novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which changed people's thinking about slavery. It was a book that was published in 1.5 million copies around the world. Queen Victoria in England read the book and wept. She cried at the depiction of slavery. Now, one thing you need to know is that it was a tale of slave life. It did make it seem like there were, good white people and bad white people, and it's a little bit like cardboard cutouts, a little bit like a morality fable or a parable sometimes. And there's a little girl, a little plantation owner's daughter, and she loves this black slave, this man, Uncle Tom, and they have this friendship. And when she dies, there's a sense that everything's falling apart. We have a lot of sympathy for this young white girl along with the black slaves. And so the hard thing is that Uncle Tom, this slave named Uncle Tom, he is very well behaved. He takes the punishments that his white owners give to him, and he always does what they want to the best of his ability. The name Uncle Tom now is used in a negative way by many people to show a person who accepts their fate rather than fighting against it. I think the book is actually a very beautiful book. I think it's a story that was intended to change hearts and minds, and I don't think it shows the slaves in a negative way. But again, I understand how many people get so angry when they confront the issue of slavery and they see a book by a white woman as maybe not being as helpful as it might be. So that was Harriet Beecher Stowe. One more person we need to talk about is the man in our title, John Brown. Who was John Brown? Well, John Brown was a character, to say the least. And he's someone who seems to pop up throughout this story of the pre-Civil War period. In the 1830s, 1837 to be exact, a man who was running a newspaper that was writing against slavery. He was surrounded by basically a mob that wanted to burn down his newspaper, the newspaper office, and get rid of all of his newspapers. And he came out to fight them, and they killed him. And this led to an uproar all over the North, especially. And John Brown was the member of a church, and in that church they were discussing this incident, and he stood up in church and he said, before all these witnesses, I swear that I will give my entire life to fight against slavery. And from that point he did. You should know that he was connected to Kansas because his grown children ended up moving there. And in 1854, Congress decided to let Kansas and Nebraska, those territories, they were not states, Congress allowed them to decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery or not have slavery. And there was a balance in the United States between slave states and free states. And so this was a threat, because if you had more free states, then slavery could be abolished. If you had more slave states, then slavery could be declared to be legal everywhere. Well, that led to a war basically in Kansas. And Kansas was known as Bleeding Kansas because of this warfare. And thousands of pro-slavery activists moved to Kansas. They're trying to stuff the ballot box. They're trying to get there and then vote in favor of slavery so that Kansas will be a slave state. And as a result, you had armed conflicts, people fighting each other. The massacre of Lawrence is very well known as one of those times when pro-slavery forces crossed over from Missouri and basically killed people in Lawrence, Kansas. Well, the Potawatomi massacre is the first instance where John Brown actually was involved in anti-slavery warfare, only it wasn't really warfare. What he did is he snuck out with a group of anti-slavery friends. They had swords, and they went and they killed some pro-slavery settlers in Kansas. And so that was the Potawatomi massacre. So John Brown, we can't think of him as a hero in the sense that we see other heroes. We have to be careful because he did commit a heinous act. In his mind, those people were evil, and so he was justified in killing them, even if they were unarmed, even if they were sleeping. That he felt he was justified, and we don't believe that there is any justification for that kind of violence. So he was a part of the Bleeding Kansas story. Later on, in 1859, he went to Harper's Ferry, which was in Virginia at that time, and it has become West Virginia today. But basically, he made a raid to get some weapons from a federal depot, and he was surrounded, and there was a gun battle, and people died. He wasn't successful, and he was arrested and put on trial and then eventually executed. People saw him, though, as a martyr, that he was fighting against slavery, that he was taking up arms against what he saw was evil. And so that's why the song John Brown's Body, it goes, John Brown's body is a moldering in the grave. Okay, the idea is he gave his life, and we need to remember his sacrifice. And the tune of that song was the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which, glory, glory, hallelujah. It's a famous hymn that was the marching song during the Civil War. But John Brown's Body was kind of this resistance song, this song reminding people before the Civil War that they should fight against slavery. So I hope that helps you understand some of the factors that led to the U.S. Civil War. So the Civil War started long before the first shots were fired in 1860 and 1861. It's important to see that the Civil War was a process, and it had to do with the different character of the North and the South. The North was largely an industrial area, industrialized, and they depended on trading. And so there wasn't the same need for slave labor in the North. In the South, it was agricultural land, and because of the products that were grown there, there was a high demand for cheap labor, and that translated in their minds to slave labor. So Even early on in the 1760s, a line was created just west of Delaware, and it basically said that anything south of that line was the limit of slavery, but slavery could not go beyond that line, and it was called the Mason-Dixon line. And gradually that line would shift, because there was this balance between free states and slave states. And so as the United States expanded, new states were brought into the country, or it was proposed that they would become states. There had to be something to balance that out. Otherwise, both sides would have felt that war was inevitable. And so there was this long controversy about what to do in certain parts of this new country as it expanded. These territories were becoming more and more populated, and those territories wanted to be a part of the United States. We can see this even in 1820. In 1820, there was something called the Missouri Compromise, and it had to do with the feeling that you couldn't keep adding slave territory, but the people in Missouri wanted to be a slave state. So a new line was created at 36 degrees, 30 minutes, and that was the new line that said slavery cannot go to the north of that line. And the compromise was that Missouri, even though it was above that 36-30 line, it could continue to be slave state and would be admitted to the Union. And on the other hand, Maine would be admitted as a free state. So really, it's again about keeping a balance. If Maine is going to come in as a free state, then Missouri has to come in as a slave state to keep the balance. Another escalation in tensions happened with the Dred Scott case in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave, and he was taken by his slave owner to the north, and he settled in the north for a long period of time. His owner actually was with the military, and because he had lived for such a long time on free soil, there was this understanding that he could sue to gain his freedom. But the Supreme Court decided the Dred Scott case against Dred Scott and said, no, he was not free, and he had to return to belong to his master once again, that he was property, that he had no rights. This is a very important decision, and abolitionists will see it as basically the line in the sand that says that slavery is not going to change and that the only way to overcome slavery is to fight. So the Dred Scott decision in many ways was, again, like the first shot of the Civil War. Lincoln, President Lincoln, in future years, but at this time just a senator, he was very aware of what was happening, and he did not come out as an abolitionist. In fact, his wife was the daughter of a slave owner in Kentucky. And so this is one of those amazing things of history that even though he was surrounded by people who thought that slavery was not a problem, that it should be legal, Abraham Lincoln had convictions. He had his beliefs that all men are created equal. And he believed that a house that is divided against itself will not be able to stand. That is his famous quote. And so he compared the United States to a house that's divided against itself. And he said, it's either going to become all of one thing or all of another. And he was right. So Lincoln was a rising star in the new Republican Party. His opponent, Stephen Douglas, was actually the incumbent senator in Illinois. He was the one who was representing Illinois, and Lincoln was running against him to become senator of Illinois. During that campaign, they agreed to have debates in all of the districts of Illinois. And basically it came down to 7 times where they would appear together and debate each other, mainly over the issue of slavery. Now, Douglas had actually been responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had led to the idea that Kansas and Nebraska could choose for themselves to have slavery. It was called popular sovereignty. And this idea sounds like it's reasonable, but the thing is, there was not supposed to be any slavery in the territories, and that opened the door for some of those territories to become slave states. And so Lincoln was against slavery in the territories, and Douglas basically opened the door and said it was okay. Now, the Compromise of 1850 is another thing to mention just because it includes our own state, California. And it happened because California had the gold rush. They were going to become a state in the Union. They wanted to be a free state. And that was a threat to the rest of the country. And so basically, after the Mexican-American War, there was all this territory in the Southwest, including New Mexico and Utah. And so the end of the Compromise of 1850 was that Utah and New Mexico could decide about slavery through popular sovereignty, but that California would be admitted as a free state. Again, keeping the balance. There always has to be some kind of compromise. This just put off the inevitable, though. Now, Lincoln won the election. He became the senator from Illinois, and that was a very symbolic victory for the country and for Republicans, and it catapulted Lincoln to the forefront to become president in the election of 1860. Well, Lincoln won that election, and it was a divided vote. You had a Northern Democratic Party and a Southern Democratic Party, and those were divided over the issue of slavery. And so as a result, Lincoln was able to squeak in with a victory. Immediately, some of the southern states started to leave the United States. They left the Union, they seceded. And this was happening while President Buchanan, James Buchanan, was still president, and he did nothing about it. And so when we look at the causes of the Civil War, I think we also have to look at President Buchanan and the fact that he just did nothing. When we talk about the beginning of the Civil War, I think it's important to mention both Sumner and Sumter. Now make sure you keep those two straight. Charles Sumner was actually he was a senator, and he was attacked on the Senate floor because he made a comment regarding another senator's family members, and it was all about slavery. And so it showed that this heated rhetoric, this attacking each other on the Senate floor, eventually led to Charles Sumner getting beaten with a cane. And people in the South approved of this tactic. And so it was a sign that this was not going to end without violence. Once President Lincoln came into office, the Confederacy had already established itself, and these are the states that had seceded from the Union. And in April, Fort Sumter, which was a small federal outpost off the coast of South Carolina, it was attacked, it was bombarded, and eventually taken over. And that was the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. So the Confederacy elected their own president. Jefferson Davis, he had been a senator from Mississippi, and he had actually served as the Secretary of War, which is like our defense secretary today. And so he was a very respected member of the government previously. And now he would have his capital in Richmond, Virginia, which would just be 100 miles from Washington, D.C., where President Lincoln would have his capital. The two sides had nicknames. They were basically called by the colors of their uniforms. The Union, the federal government, had blue uniforms, and so they were the blue. And then the Confederacy had gray uniforms, and they were the gray. Why did they have different color uniforms, and why did it even matter? And you have to understand, this is an era when wars were supposed to be fought among gentlemen. And so there was still that tradition that there was honor in warfare, no matter what side you were on. So you had the blue and the gray. The Northerners were called Yankees, and you remember the Yankee Doodle Dandy song from the Revolutionary War, and that continued. Northerners were called Yankees. You've heard of that. And Southerners were called the Confederates, the rebels. So those are important names to know. They were also nicknamed the Rebs, Johnny Reb. So you'll hear that a lot when you read literature about this time period, the Yanks and the Rebs. What about battles and strategy? Well, I'm not going to go through every single battle. I think it would be something that you can find in other resources, and so I'm not going to go blow by blow. This is a long war, and there are many turning points. You should know that the first battle was the First Battle of Bull Run, and it was a Confederate victory, and it was a case where it revealed two things. One, that the Confederates were a lot stronger than the Yankees probably thought they were, but also that this was not going to be a quick war. So for the Confederates, they realized that this would be a long, drawn-out war. And the generals, the leaders of the two sides, were Robert E. Lee, who had been the general for the federal government and the United States Army, and now he was serving the Confederacy as the leader of the Confederate forces. And Ulysses S. Grant was the leader of the Northern forces. And you also need to know the name General Stonewall Jackson, who was kind of the right-hand general for General Lee. So General Lee and General Jackson were the most notable generals in the South. You also should be aware of the fact that this was the first war where you had battles between armored ships. And so you have a battle between the Monitor, the Northern ship, the Union ship, and the Confederate ship, the Merrimack. And the Merrimack was later called the Virginia. And so you had the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia fighting each other. And it was basically a draw. They didn't decide anything there, but it is a very interesting thing to note. The Battle of Antietam Creek was significant. Sadly, it's significant because it was the bloodiest single day in United States history, with 22,000 people dead, wounded, or missing. 22,000 Americans in one day. Now, the Battle of Antietam was considered, it's also called the Battle of Sharpsburg by the Southerners. They often had different names for the different battles. And Antietam was considered a victory for the Union because it was, they had shown that they could keep the Confederacy from invading the North, invading Maryland. And General McClellan, who was another general from the North that you should know, so Grant and McClellan at this point, and Lee and Jackson in the South. And there are others, and we will mention others, but just know that this victory actually gave momentum to Lincoln, and he then declared the Emancipation Proclamation, which would basically give freedom to all of the slaves in the South. And the intention was to create rebellion and uprising in the South that would weaken the Confederacy and the Confederate position. So in 1862, that's exactly what Lincoln did. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and it wasn't too long before the famous Battle of Gettysburg. Now, again, the Confederacy is fighting the battle on their own territory. The war is in the South, and that has been one of the major advantages that the Confederacy had, is they knew the South, and as the Union came down, they were considered to be invaders, and so they had a tactical advantage. They also tried to invade the North, but when they couldn't invade the North, it showed their weakness. And Gettysburg, again, was a battle trying to invade Pennsylvania, but once the Union won the Battle of Gettysburg, it closed off the ability of the Confederacy to invade the North, and basically showed that this would be, again, a long war, and the Confederacy was losing their leverage. One thing that happened at the Battle of Gettysburg was an African-American regiment from Massachusetts led by a Colonel Shaw. There's a fantastic movie that was made about this, and African Americans were allowed to fight for the Union Army as a group, and they had the ability to fight for their own freedom, because this war was really about slavery. Another famous general that we need to talk about is General Sherman. He was a Union general, and he was ruthless. And his plan was to, again, continue to push into Confederate territory and to burn down Atlanta. And so he is famous for burning down the city of Atlanta and then marching from Atlanta to the sea. And in his path, he created, a mile wide of destruction, burning down farms, and that was to basically keep the Confederate soldiers and the Confederacy in general from having enough food. So it was ruthless, and it was very, very effective. And as a result, the Confederacy was demoralized, and that was maybe the greatest turning point in making sure that the war was won, along with the siege of Vicksburg, which was horrible. And the stories out of Vicksburg were that people had no food, and bad things were happening during that siege. And eventually Vicksburg collapsed, gave up, and the Union had a major victory there. So obviously you have Antietam, Gettysburg, Sherman's march to the sea, and the siege of Vicksburg. Those are probably the four greatest turning points of the Civil War. If you know those four, I think you're in really good shape. Now, in 1864, there was another election, and Lincoln was reelected. Of course, the Confederate States, they weren't a part of the United States, and so Lincoln was reelected for a second term. So the final battle that really broke the general's back, that happened when Richmond fell. Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy. Once Richmond fell, Lee was in complete retreat, and he eventually lost the last battle at Appomattox Courthouse and would surrender there. And this sounds like a happy ending. The Union wins, the slaves are free, and everyone can go home to his or her family. So we need to remember 5 days in April, and that this war lasted 5 Aprils: 1861, 62, 63, 64, 65. And 5 days in April changed the world. On April 9th, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse after losing that battle. And on April 14th, at Ford's Theater, during a performance of My American Cousin, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who had been an actor. And he had been somebody who was upset by Lincoln's obviously by everything that Lincoln represented, but in particular by the fact that Lincoln was going to give citizenship to black people, and John Wilkes Booth wouldn't stand for that. And now we can basically tie up the loose ends. Unfortunately, those loose ends are too many to count. And we will go quickly through the post-war period known as Reconstruction. And honestly, the things that I am going to tell you, you probably can already guess. First of all, this was a huge victory. It was a victory for humanity, but it didn't make everything all better. And people in the South, even though they had lost the war, they were resentful. And so troops were stationed from the Union. They were stationed in the South as an occupying force. And the South saw them as invaders, even after they had lost the war. And the South was in ruins because, remember, the South had been the battleground. That had been their advantage, but now it would be their curse. And so all around them, the Southerners, the former Confederacy, saw the ruins of its civilization, burned down plantations, and African Americans that had been freed. Many of those African Americans stayed in the South. They were promised in January of 1865 by General Sherman that they would receive 40 acres and a mule. So essentially, their feeling was, we don't want to leave our homes. They had grown to consider the South as their home. And so, they wanted to stay in places like Mississippi. The problem is that that never really happened. It happened in some cases, and former slaves were allowed to settle with homesteads in the West, in places like Nebraska and Kansas. And so there was progress, and specifically the former slaves were supposed to be given jobs. But what was happening, along with these rules that were being created by the United States government, local states were creating black codes, basically rules against black people, and this would create new segregation. Essentially, they were recreating the conditions of slavery. They were keeping black people from getting jobs or education, and they were making their wages so small that it didn't really matter that they were free. They could never have enough money to own their own land and to make a living. And so there was a struggle for control of the South, even after the Civil War. Now, once President Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president became president, and that was Andrew Johnson, who was actually a Southern Democrat. And this is fascinating that a Northern Republican and Southern Democrat were on the same ticket. And Andrew Johnson seemed to be a respectable person in many ways, but he had this understanding that he was kind of a defender of the South against the North coming down as what we call carpetbaggers and just buying up all the land and taking advantage of the defeated South. And so he defended states' rights, and he got in trouble with the Republicans in Congress, who were called the Radical Republicans. And eventually he was impeached when he tried to get rid of his Secretary of War, who had almost been assassinated with Lincoln. That was Secretary of War Stanton, and he fired him. President Johnson fired him, and Congress said you can't do that, and then impeached him, and he survived impeachment proceedings. So you had carpetbaggers who were Northerners who were taking advantage of the South. You also had scalawags who were basically kind of like mercenaries in the South, criminals, vagabonds that went around abusing black people, sometimes lynching and killing them. So all of those things are important for understanding the South in ruins. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was created by President Lincoln to help former slaves reintegrate into society, and that lasted for a year. And it did provide some support, some comfort for those former slaves. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, giving black people, former slaves, the right to citizenship and the right to vote. Unfortunately, that didn't make everything all better. And a prime example of this is when black people were protesting in New Orleans to get full citizenship and voting rights under kind of a new constitution in the South, and a mob attacked them, and it was a massacre. And so the New Orleans massacre reminds us that there were still lingering long-term problems. There would be a racist legacy in the South, a legacy of resentment and just prejudice against black people, and that led to the black codes, the rules for what black people could do, and also the Ku Klux Klan, which was basically a mob that went around in disguise and was vigilante justice for things that were crimes or not even crimes, imagined wrongdoing. Again, we might hope that that disappeared with the coming of the 20th century. But what happened, especially after World War I, black people started feeling that they deserved more rights as citizens, and they shouldn't be segregated. But what happened was new monuments were made during that post-World War I period, especially in the late 19 teens and 1920s, and monuments were created to Civil War heroes in the South, basically monuments to slavery, monuments to the Confederacy, to show black people, to intimidate black people into thinking that they will never be considered to be equal to white people in the South. So the effects of the Civil War are very plain. First of all, there's racial inequality. But secondly, you have a very diverse population that will continue to develop and move forward. And so how does that lead us to today? Today, we have a situation where we have large populations of African Americans in states like Georgia and South Carolina. And there is an increased power that those people have, but unfortunately, we still have lingering effects of racism, restrictions on what black people can do in terms of things like voting. It is illegal because of voting rights acts passed by the government. It's illegal to discriminate against black people or anyone when it comes to voting, but there are all kinds of ways that people can disqualify voters based on their education, based on not filing the correct forms. And so even today, we still have discrimination against black people who may not have the same access to information, and as a result, they are shut out of the political process. Now, here are some other effects of the Civil War. You know that Reconstruction was a matter of rebuilding the economy of the South, but also it was reintegrating black people in society and restoring those states to the Union and full participation in the government. And the laws that were created, the black codes that were created in the South after the Civil War, those eventually developed into what we call Jim Crow laws, which separated black people and white people throughout the South. And it basically said, Because of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision at the end of the 1800s, it said that as long as you have two of everything, that you can keep black people and white people separate. Well, of course, the majority white people will have the best of everything: schools, water fountains, swimming pools, whatever. They're going to have the best, and black people did not. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was very important for establishing that African Americans in the South would have voting rights, would have the right to own property. But again, those Jim Crow laws were ways to get around that federal law. The Compromise of 1877 was the idea that finally you can give citizenship to black people in the South, but the troops will be withdrawn. And so the Northern troops finally left the South, and when that happened, black people in the South lost a lot of their protection. And so that compromise is still lingering with us today. The fact that there are many people in the South who have been disenfranchised over the decades, and the effects still continue today. This is a current war. Even though the war is supposed to be in the past and it's supposed to be history, it is a current battle that we are still confronting today as we discuss the Confederate flag, Civil War monuments and memorials, the situation that we have in states like Georgia and South Carolina, where now the black population should be at a point where they have a significant amount of power, but they have been kept from power because of the mechanisms of government. These are issues we need to face in our own time.